All right, good morning, everyone. I'm sorry that this is going out a little late. I had to take my son to the doctor, and yesterday was just a little bit crazy. So we are just going to go ahead and get started. Our lesson today continues on this food chain, food web, ecosystem journey that we started, but now we're going to be looking more closely at each of the organisms and figuring out ways that we can classify them. Classifying is basically just a fancy word for putting things into categories. What is something that I can describe them with? How can I, identify them and put them in a specific sort of category? But first, our do now. Why do plants do photosynthesis? And number two, how do animals get energy? How do you think that they get energy? Okay, so for our debrief, number one, we know that plants go through the process of photosynthesis in order to create food for themselves, right? We've learned about that fancy sugar word glucose, and that is one of the products, right? One of the things that comes after photosynthesis. And the food is in the plant and it's used for what it needs. So that glucose is already inside the plant. It doesn't need to do anything to bring it in. The process of photosynthesis happens inside. So the food is already where it needs to be in order to be used for whatever is needed. Now, for number two, animals get their energy by eating. And we're going to talk more about this today. But they need to eat because, unlike plants, they are not able to use that energy from the sun. So what we're going to do today is we're going to learn how to classify or put into categories organisms in a food web. You all have been looking at food chains, you advance to food webs. You're able to now create your own food webs. And so we're going to add just one more step to that and be able to classify the organisms in a food web. So I want you to look at these pictures here. What do you see? Well, I can bet that a lot of us probably answered plants. And that's true. These are plants. But I want us to start pushing past, that very obvious answer and really think of their function. And we know that all of these are organisms that do photosynthesis, right? These are cacti, these are various succulents. You have a tree, a little seedling, you have flowers. These are all things that do photosynthesis. They go through the process of photosynthesis in order to grow and get their energy. In a food web, these are called producers, and we can identify a producer as an organism that makes their own food. And it's usually with the energy from the sun. But these plants that we kind of saw behind, these are not the only ones. These are not the only organisms, on Earth that do photosynthesis. We are very often forgetting that there's an entire four huge oceans, right? And that's really big marine environments that need producers. And you're not going to find, a tree at the bottom of the sea. What you're going to find, however, is something like kelp or seaweed. These are marine plants that do photosynthesis. You're also going to find phytoplankton. You guys were introduced to this during your homework from Wednesday, I believe. These are microscopic plants, little tiny, tiny things that do photosynthesis in the ocean. They usually float near the surface, right? Makes sense because they need that sun's energy, they need that sunlight. And then other smaller things like zooplankton eat these phytoplankton, right? So one of the things that I want you to notice is it says phyto. This means light, but it also kind of reminds us of the word photosynthesis. And so if you're ever confused and you see phytoplankton, right, this is a plankton, a microscopic plant that does photosynthesis in the ocean. And lastly, there's algae, right? Sometimes that gross green stuff that we see if you've ever had a pool and you have that nasty slimy, those are also a microscopic organism that does photosynthesis. And these are the producers in a marine environment. Now, next we're going to look at other organisms. And so as they start popping on the screen, I want you to just try to see what it is that they have in common. What would you call these? That's one of my favorite ones. All right, so what do you see on the screen? Well, if you want to classify them broadly, you can say that they are animals. Yes, I know there's a baby and a child. We technically fall into the animal kingdom. But I want you to also look at them again and what do they all have in common? What are they all doing? Okay, so these are all animals. And these are consumers. And I'm sure most of us said that we saw that they are eating, and that's correct. A consumer is an organism that gets its energy by eating plants or other animals. But the most important keyword here is by eating. Consumers need to eat. You need to eat. I mean, we don't need to eat that entire packet of Oreos that we've probably gone through during quarantine, but we need to eat, right? We, like I said last time, we can't just go lay out in the sun and then all of our energy and our food is formed. That would be fantastic. We'd all save so much money. Unfortunately, that's just not how it works. We need to eat in order to incorporate and introduce that matter and that energy into our bodies. Okay, now I'm going to play this video. It is not the cutest video, but I want you to, as you're watching it, just try to take mental notes of what's happening. I'm going to try to make it go a little fast. Oh, okay. There we go. Oh my goodness gracious. I'm just going to stop touching it, you guys. Sorry. So basically this was over 74 days. So what you're seeing was there for 74 days, and every 40 minutes they took a picture. Sorry, I really want to get rid of that advertisement for you guys, but I'm afraid it's going to knock us to the next slide. So just observe and see what's happening. Observe closely. All right, so sorry if we felt that was a little gross, but that's actually a really important video. I just want you to take a quick moment to jot down what it is that you saw. That video brings us to one of our next categories, and these are all organisms that serve similar functions. We have in this category, we have things like mushrooms. We call them fungi, earthworms, snails or slugs, flies, but we also have bacteria, right? Bacteria, microbes. And these are also needed in the marine environment. So this is actually a sea slug and a brittle starfish. And so what all of these are is these are decomposers. Now, decomposers are organisms that get energy by breaking down dead organisms. I'm not even going to finish this sentence really quick because I just need us to focus on this. They get energy by breaking down dead organisms. Do you see the word eating anywhere here? No, right? And that's because true decomposers do not eat. They do not need to, process these things. They kind of are able to break down the dead organisms on contact. Now, the most true decomposers that we have are bacteria, microbes, and fungi. And so what the decomposer's role is one of the most important because it breaks down dead organisms. But there's a second part. They recycle nutrients into the soil. So what that means is that after they break down the dead organisms, after they break down the matter, they're able to take that the most important nutrients in it, the most important matter, and recycle it back into the soil. Now I want you to think of a world without decomposers. I know decomposers, right? They look gross. They're not the cutest little animals. Some decomposers are also like roaches, centipedes, right? Really not cute things. But if we were to not have decomposers, we would be in so much trouble. Because every time that a tree falls in a forest, mushrooms begin to decompose it and break down those dead organisms. Every time an animal dies in the wild, you get things like flies and bacteria and worms, maggots, right, that come and break down the organisms. Now, if these things didn't exist, nothing would ever break down a dead organism. All of these really gross dead things would just be piled up everywhere. And that would not be very healthy or very good. And so these things are then able to take all of that matter, right? Because think about it, an animal eats, they get all of these energy, they get all of this matter, all of these, good nutrients. And then when they die, if there's no decomposer, there's no way to bring that back. There's no way to close that circle and reincorporate those nutrients. And that's the role of a decomposer. A decomposer, and I just want you to really quickly just read this out loud with me. Decomposer is an organism that gets energy by breaking down dead organisms and recycles nutrients into the soil. They do not eat. Decomposers don't eat. I'm going to say it like 7 times. Decomposers don't eat. Decomposers don't eat, okay? Decomposers break down dead organisms and recycle nutrients into the soil. Now, yes, I know, we're going to watch this again. This time I'm going to try to do this right. But this time as you're watching it, I want you to look for evidence that decomposers are present. You're going to tell me 2 specific things that you saw happening that show you decomposers are present. Ooh, I'm seeing something right here. I'm seeing a lot of some things. And right there too. They're back. So what is evidence that there are decomposers present? All right. More classifications. Woohoo! So we know producers. A producer is anything that gets its energy and food from the sun. We know consumers, anything that eats, right? A consumer is anything that eats, and a decomposers break down dead organisms. And let's go ahead and then let's classify the consumers. An herbivore, say herbivore. An herbivore is a primary consumer. That means that an herbivore is the very first consumer in a food web. Herbivores are animals that eat mainly plants. What word can we substitute this instead of plants? Herbivores are animals that eat mainly. What do you think we could substitute this with? We could substitute this with producers. They eat plants, right? But there's also, again, that phytoplankton, kelp, algae, flowers, all of these things that we don't always think of. And some of these include things like, leaves, grass, flowers, seeds. Seeds are also counted as producers. Roots, fruits, bark, pollen, and much more. Some examples of herbivores are deers, horses, rabbits, cows, sheep, bees are herbivores, and grasshoppers. Next, we have carnivores. These are secondary consumers, and you don't need to worry too much about this, but basically that means that they are at least 2 steps away from the producers. Now, these are things that eat mainly meat. I like this graphic. I do not like this word because not all meat is, quote unquote, meat. What this would have been better was if it said that they eat other organisms that are not producers. They eat non-producers, basically. Because an insect, sometimes we don't think of that as meat. We just think, oh, okay, sometimes we think of meat more like, oh, they eat a zebra or like those really big animals. But something like a cricket, an ant, if that's what you eat, you are technically a carnivore. So a lot of the carnivores are felines, right? Those really big cats, lions, tigers, your cat at home, birds of prey. So eagles, hawks, owls, any of those. The big one, sharks, frogs, but also spiders, right? Spiders eat flies. A fly is not a producer, therefore, that makes a spider a carnivore. So, a carnivore are animals that eat meat, other animals. And last, omnivores. Say omnivore. So, an omnivore are animals that are able to eat plants and animals. We fall into this category. So do most bears, right? They love to eat berries, but they also eat salmon. They also eat a lot of fish. Raccoons will just eat anything, right? You got to make sure your trash cans are closed if there's a raccoon around. Most primates, so apes, monkeys, orangutans, gorillas, and seagulls and other birds. So these are all examples of omnivores. So these are things that eat both plants and animals. Now we're going to do a quick check for understanding. And I'm going to go ahead and draw a Venn diagram. Thank goodness for this awesome app that you make a circle and it makes it a nice circle, because y'all saw how sad my circles were. So this is a Venn diagram, and we know that a Venn diagram is used to compare and contrast. So what we're going to do at some point, it should start writing. There we go. I'm going to write a category or an identifier over here, and I'm going to write one over there. So we know that this identifier is going to be very specific to this section. This one will be specific to this section, and then this one should be an overlap. So in this side, we're looking at animals that get their energy or matter from plants or producers, right? Then on this side, we are looking for organisms that get their energy from animals. Okay. So now what we're going to do is should be labeling, animals or other consumers, right? We can use either of these interchangeably, just like for plants and producers, we can use these interchangeably. I still prefer producers. So this is 1, 2, and 3. Pause it right here. Where do you think that carnivores should go? Where do you think that omnivores should go? Ooh. And where do you think, sorry about that. And where do you think that herbivores should go? All right, let's see what our answers were. So in this section, if you wrote herbivores, you are correct. We know that herbivores are organisms that get their energy or their matter from plants and producers. Carnivores get their energy from animals or consumers. And omnivores get their energy from both. Now this next video is just really quickly, we don't normally, oh, sorry, you guys, good Lord, all of these reminders, sorry. Let's go back. We know that when we've been drawing the food webs, we haven't been including decomposers. Now, honestly, we normally don't. But I'm going to show you that if you ever need to include them, the way that you can do is you just make this general, it's not really a box, but it shows that everything in it is included. And so what I did was I added my decomposers, worms, and flies, right? Because technically any of these things can give it energy once they die. And then I had it just circle back towards the producers, and we know that it's giving them nutrients. But one of the things that I want to do now is I want to label all of my objects. So I'm going to label my producers with a P, and I did that here with the berries. And now I'm going to label my herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores. Now I know that my mouse gets its energy from the berries. That's an herbivore. I can see that my ant gets its energy from the grass. That's an herbivore. And let's do the rabbit. I see that my rabbit gets its energy from the berries and the grass. It's an herbivore. What mistake did I make? Yes, a rabbit also gets energy from the ant. That would make it an omnivore. We need to be very careful that we're checking where all of the energy comes from. If we ignored this, then that would look like an herbivore. We know that an armadillo is a carnivore. It gets its energy from the ants, from another animal, the snake as well, and the coyote. We also know that these at the top are decomposers. Okay. Now, the reason that I did this was I wanted to show you, you're going to have a homework assignment that's similar. Notice that I didn't label consumers, because we know that basically anything that is not at the bottom of the food chain, anything that is not a producer is a consumer, and we have better, more specific identifiers for these here at the top. Let's practice. All right, so which of these animals is a carnivore? A red fox. Good job, y'all. Which of them is an herbivore? The deer. Which organism is a consumer? The red fox. And which animal is an omnivore? Try to remember what omnivore means. The black bear, right? So we see the black bear eats the rabbit, but it also eats berries, which is a producer. Which animal is an herbivore? The rabbit. Which organism is a producer? And which of these animals is a carnivore? The owl. I know a lot of us want to say black bear because we see it coming from the rabbit, but the owl is the only true carnivore here. All right, so let's recap, which means it's time for our major keys. Major key number 1. Producers get their energy from the sun. Consumers get their energy by eating. Major key number 2. Decomposers don't eat. They break down dead organisms and return nutrients to the soil. Major key number 3. Animals can be categorized by what they eat. And our final discussion question. All right, thank you for tuning in. Make sure to watch the video until the end so your answers get automatically submitted. Your exit ticket again today is assigned through Google Classroom. We'll see you next week.